All right, continuing on, let's take a look at Apple, who barely scrapes by and survives this onslaught that becomes IBM. Actually, IBM doesn't survive, as a matter of fact. So they didn't understand that problem with compatibility either, right? So I already stressed the fact that the Mac was so expensive, but really what Steve Jobs says in his own words is that he's going to transition these Apple II buyers to the Mac. The problem is that the Apple II, while it was expensive, it was around $1,200. The Mac was about $2,400 to $3,600. Where you're doubling what somebody has to do. That's a big ask. That's a big ask. On top of that, none of your Apple software that you've been trained on and have been using forever is going to work. And there's a ton of businesses at that point that are using Apples that are not using IBMs. So that was a bad move, right? But hey, you know, the guy's like 22 years old. What does he know? And that's also part of the problem. He also says that, actually. So these Apple IIs, they just keep upgrading it. They make an Apple IIc that's got better color and it's compact, and they do a lot of stuff with it. So they have that going. But basically, let me just sum it up here. What should have happened with the Steve Jobs scenario was, instead of going and saying, let's go make the Mac, that's the next big thing, and we're going to force everybody to go do that. And you know, and his idea of it won't be that much more expensive than the Apple II, but then getting halfway through the project and going, wow, this is going to be massively expensive. He should have said, you know what, we're going to figure out how to transition people from the II into a graphical system. So if you think about this, the Mac was released in 1984, and I watched a guy on YouTube that totally agrees with this concept. Now, in 1986, 2 years after the Mac release, Apple produces something known as the aptitude GS, which stood for graphics and sound. And I'm going to show you that interface. But the great thing is that Wozniak understood it was backwards compatible with the Apple II line. So you could actually launch an Apple II app off of it, or application program, and it would go into Apple II mode and run that. The truth that we found is that most of the time people are going to upgrade to the new technology, but they don't want to be forced to do it. They want to have the time to do it. And so this would have created that time. But because of the huge heavy investment in the Mac line, Apple limited the processor power so that it wouldn't compete with the Mac. What? Yeah, so they're using a different processor, but it's almost as fast as the Mac is. So you got these two developments going on within the system. One's only 2 years behind, right? If you hadn't focused on the Mac and focused on Apple II, what are people using these for? How are they using it? How much does that cost? What did you feel about, you know, purchasing it? Just done some research, for heaven's sakes, right? Then they would have understood, okay, the deal is these places have spent thousands or at least hundreds of dollars on other stuff besides our product. So let's make sure we can carry those products forward. See, Microsoft got that. Microsoft understood that, and Apple didn't understand it. So just real quick, I'm going to jump over to some IBM, an appetite for performance. Anyway, so let's look up Apple II GS. Look at some images, and this is what it looked like, and this was the graphical system. So we'll pull that one up. There it is. See if we can get a bigger one. Yeah, that's a good picture. Right, so look at that. Not only does this thing have color, but it looks pretty much identical to the Mac. Yeah, the screen resolution is not as high. The Mac screen resolution is really nice, but this had sound, it had graphics, it could do games, it could do all sorts of stuff on it. 2 years later, that's the worst mistake that Apple made in the history of all of Apple. The fact that they did not, back to my window, the fact that they did not just try to move people along, try to keep them in their ecosystem as they moved along. And now, of course, it seems like that makes a ton of sense to us, but back then they really didn't understand what was happening, and they thought there was a limited pool of people that were willing to spend Think about it, 1980s money, $3,200. What is that? $8,000 for a computer? And they thought that that would happen. And then the fact that they slowed down the GS so that it wouldn't interfere with the Mac. They dumbed down the technology. That's always a bad thing to do that. They could have held on to what they had. Now they just barely survive, right? Because the switch to Mac just bungles everything. It's too expensive. And basically Steve Jobs is ousted and they just dwindle and dwindle and dwindle until Steve Jobs comes back and they make the iPod, and that reinvents them basically. But wow, just barely. But Microsoft came out on top. Not because of the IBM alliance. That was the first step. So I say not just because. That was the first step. IBM, that was important in the beginning. But they focused on making sure that software would work and across as many PCs as they possibly could. Right? So their missteps are easy to see now, but they're not at the time, right? So Microsoft did what they needed to do. See, both Apple and Commodore created incredible products that influenced computing for years to come, but Commodore, who the heck are they? And don't realize that they influenced computing for 20, 30 years. But we do remember Apple, right? Because they still lived, they survived. All right, so basically, let's finish it up. Putting it all together, the PC revolution started in homes and schools and small businesses with companies such as Commodore, Apple, Atari, Texas Instruments, Tandy. Those were all really inexpensive computers at the time compared to IBM's. And then that shifted over to the businesses. And then IBM had a problem. So this is something that I haven't mentioned. There's actually a series that lasts about 3 years, and it's called Halt and Catch Fire. You can look up what that term means, but it's a really good retelling. So they place a fictitious company within the history of what happens, but it really retells the story pretty damn good in an entertaining way. So what IBM did at the time that I haven't really talked about is that they were so far behind, right? They really thought, oh crap, we missed it again, right? We almost missed the big dog mainframe era, and now we're going to miss the PC era. So they took off-the-shelf parts, and because they took those off-the-shelf parts, it meant that companies like Compaq could try to put together a compatible, right? It's all off the shelf. There's nothing particular that IBM used except for one thing, and that was the basic input-output systems, the BIOS. That had how do programs talk to the hardware, especially then. It wasn't how the OS talks to it just, but the programs. The programs interacted with the hardware directly. And so they'd have that burned in, and it was particular to them. Well, they found Compaq was the first ones to find a little legal loophole, which basically allowed them to take somebody who'd never used a computer, that was an engineer, that was the important part, and then put them in a room and give them all the specifications for what it had, what this new piece of hardware software combination had to comply with. Now, where did that come from? Well, that came from another engineer that was using an IBM computer and looking at what it was doing and creating that list. And then that way they could hand that off, this person never seeing an IBM computer, never using one, and then design a chip that basically would fulfill all those requirements. So if you had the requirements correctly identified and then correctly implemented, you now had a compatible with no way that IBM could sue you. That's what they did. If IBM hadn't been behind the gun or under the gun, or however you say that, they would, of course, just created all the hardware themselves, put in all their different little protection schemes, and then, you know, IBM software would run on IBM systems. Anybody that programmed for IBM would work on theirs, but it wouldn't work on anybody else's. Just like a Mac, right? Mac will run these different things, and they can't run it on IBM or vice versa. And so that's called reverse engineering, and that's what happened to them, is they got reverse engineered out of existence. Now, the second thing that IBM tried to do is on their PS2s, their personal systems 2s, that's what that stands for. They actually tried to rein that in. They tried to bring it all in and control it again. And that didn't work for them because the compatibles, like the compacts, were actually building better systems than the IBMs. And people were losing faith in IBM. IBM lost its status, and other companies like Compaq, who HP eventually bought, gained status over them. So by the time they try to rein it all in and control it, and it's too late. And IBM had some really cool stuff. In a personal system too, this was way ahead of its time. You'd plug in a piece of hardware and it came with a floppy disk. You put the floppy disk in and it'd say, oh, I see this hardware, you want to set it up? And you go, yes, and you're done. Now that's what happens now, right? 1996, fast forward like 8 years, and that's what happens. But before it didn't. You had to set jumper pins and you had to read a manual and you had to make sure it didn't conflict with it. You had to know a lot about computers to make it happen. So that's how IBM really gets screwed out of the deal, because Microsoft is smart enough to go, look, we're going to make the OS for you, but we're going to retain the rights. We're not going to let you own the OS. And IBM had to agree because they were in such a rush. And then that gave Microsoft the opportunity so that when Compaq reversed engineered things, oh, you want to license our OS? Here's Compaq DOS. Right? You can license it from us. And so now you have all these computers running MS-DOS basically, and they win and IBM loses. So Commodore, IBM, and Apple lose the PC war. And who do they lose it to? Oh, and you should know that IBM sells its PC division to Lenovo, right? That's where they come from. So Apple's grown in popularity. It's about 10 to 15% of the market now, but they'll never even get close to 50 when it comes to desktop apps. Apple did survive long enough to catch up to mobile, and so we'll look at that later. But Microsoft, and they call this Wintel, Windows and Intel, Microsoft and Intel, and all the compatibles, they become the winners of that war. So again, the social aspect of things is pretty dang huge of why people choose what they choose. And again, a lot of times they say, oh, they chose IBM because IBM had the name. And yes, that's where it started. But then IBM lost the name and Compaq picked it up, right? So what we were most important aspects that guided the PCs in the 1980s, continued use of software investments and technology that was good enough to do the job, right? So there's a ton of things as I'm describing, but those are the two main things. They could continue to use the expensive software that they had, and it was good enough for what they needed, right? They didn't need anything more. Right, and this is part of talking to you about the early adopters and people wanting to spend money and so on. But people in business were forced to use PCs. They had no choice. And this is what PC stuff looked like. So not the easiest stuff in the world. This is Lotus 123. I think this is, gosh, I can't remember what that is. WordPerfect, Lotus 123 DBase. So this is actually Lotus 123. This is DBase, and this is WordPerfect. So not the easiest thing. If I just showed you a bunch of pictures from that time, right, and said which one did people choose, you would say, oh, they probably chose that Amiga and that Apple II GS because it's color. Doesn't that look easier? Yeah. No, they didn't choose that. They chose this. Why? Well, businesses, they forced them to. They forced them to do that. All right, so compatibility. Compatibility then becomes the name of the game, right? Am I compatible with DOS? Am I compatible with Windows? We didn't have an internet. That was not part of things. The internet brought on all of the compatibility, like things need to be compatible. It didn't happen before then. So Microsoft controlled all that compatibility in the end. It is not easy at this time to take your IBM spreadsheet and move it to your Mac or Amiga. You could do it. And people that were very smart with computers and technology, I owned an Amiga at one time, I owned a Mac at one time. And yeah, I would move stuff in and off with special programs. And I love that. I thought that was so cool. Most people do not want to do that, right? So the last fight, right? IBM chose off to sell parts. Microsoft did something else. They locked in agreements with all the major manufacturers to offer only their version of whatever it was. And when Windows 95 was released, the situation stayed the same. So Microsoft did some things behind the scenes that I think I have another assignment that you look at that on, where they basically said, hey, Dell, we're going to charge you $5 more per operating system if you sell other people's operating systems. So Dell, who sells hundreds of thousands of computers, says, well, we won't offer other operating systems. And that cinched the deal. So IBM used the off-the-shelf parts. Now you got tons of compatibles. Microsoft then comes in and says, Compaq, you're not going to offer OS2. You're not going to offer anything. There's plenty, BOS, there's other ones out there. You will not say to a person, oh yeah, and by the way, what operating system do you want installed on it? You will not say that. It will be Windows and Windows only. Otherwise, it'll cost you more to have our licensing. And of course, that was really underhanded, but it wasn't illegal to do. And that just kills all competition at the time. Right. And the other thing I mentioned here is that by the time you get to Windows 95, Microsoft has actually really narrowed down what are people using this machine for. They're using spreadsheets, they're using databases, and they're using documents. So let's take that stuff and we'll make our own, which they had already made their own for a long time, and we'll package it in with the stuff we're selling. Special prices. You can buy a Dell computer and get Microsoft Office for free with Windows 95. Right. And so no more WordPerfect, they died. No more Lotus 123, they died. No more DBase, they died. They all went away. Didn't matter if they were better or worse. They all went away because they had these package deals going on. And since that's what people were using, that's what people wanted, right? So 1987, all competition was subdued, meaning there was some competition, but not really. And they own 90% of what people needed, and that's what happened. So whether or not Microsoft understands the social factors that influence their success, it doesn't change what happened, but it does now. So I have another thing that we'll go through, but the negligence that they have shown in understanding the factors that led to their success have come to hurt them. And yeah, I use this as saying, hey, I know you've listened to this information. I'm glad that you have. And some of you are sitting there going, I don't think this is very important and it's a waste of my time. And I want to show you at a very large level, it's not a waste of your time, because Microsoft did not fully understand. It's like they understood what to do to take over a market, but they didn't understand that that's how they took over the market. That people were not choosing them because Excel was better or Word was better or any of it was better. They were choosing them because they had basically stifled the competition from anybody else. And that's because they didn't understand that, have caused them a ton of problems now, right? Microsoft had assumed that people used their systems because they liked it, not because they had to. Should have asked, people would have told you, right? Most people say, I like it. And then if you ask them, do you know anything else? And they'll go, no, not really. I've never used anything else, right? During the span of Microsoft's dominance, the internet has created a world of interconnectedness and something known as interoperability, meaning that I expect this dissimilar system to work with this dissimilar system. I expect that I can write something in Word and send it to somebody who does not have something in Word. Now, interestingly, right, Google is doing the same thing. Used to be, I could make a Google Doc and easily just say, save this as a document. Now that's a lot harder, right? Because they've got a huge portion of people that are using that. They want to stifle you from being able to leave it. That's exactly what Microsoft did, right? So that changed the mindset of people. Like, I'm not going to accept this as being compatible. I want to be able to take it out of your system and put it where I want to. And that's compatibility, right? So in many years, many computer users have switched to a Mac. Well, Windows PC sales have steadily dropped. And now that's true. You may be thinking I'm talking about something religious, and I'm not. Just looking at facts. So Mac sales have stayed level, or they've even increased, even in these times with smart devices. When the iPad was released in 2010, roughly 9 years ago, so 22 years ago now, the first Windows tablet was released way before that, 2000 and 2001, I think. So Microsoft all but ignored it because they'd already released a tablet. And then soon there were more iPads being sold than Windows PCs. And that is a fact. You can go and look at it and understand it. During that time, man, there was some crazy stuff happening. Like Dell came out and said, oh, we're not just a PC seller. HP was like, we're going to make our own tablet. So they could see that this new form factor came in, and then their notebook sales just tanked. And that's correlated, right? They understood that. So after a few years, they stopped ignoring it. And I mean, it was a few years. Then they reinvented their desktop operating system to compete, and that was Windows 8. So now we're getting so far away from 8, people are like, what is that? Go and look it up. Go and look frustrations with Windows 8 and watch some videos, right? Their whole idea was, hey, everything is moving to tablets. Let's force people to buy our tablet. How do we do that? Well, 90% of the market uses Windows. We'll make Windows basically a tablet OS. And then people will get comfortable with it, and then they'll just go and buy a tablet the next time. Well, that makes sense if you think people chose you because they liked you. It doesn't make sense if people chose you because they needed compatibility and then all the other competition was gone, right? And so they make this Windows 8, and again, go look at it, and it's just terrible. Everybody hated it. It was a huge, heavy-handed approach to progress. They forced their users to try to get custom, to get accustomed to an interface that was just phenomenally different than what they'd done before. If they had understood what was really happening in the sociality of it, they would have changed Windows 8, right? We wouldn't have needed 10. It would have changed it and just gradually changed it so that basically within 3 or 4 years, you were like, I think I'm going to buy one of those tablets. I like their form factor. I can add a keyboard if I want. And I'll just get one of the Windows ones because I'm comfortable with that. Right? And they didn't do that. They didn't do it. You'll have to look at it. Now, when this was written, Stadia, he actually says, hey, we don't want Microsoft users to use us because they have to. We want to have them use Windows because they love to. And so he finally understood, like he was brought in later, right? So he wasn't a part of all this stuff for the most part. He was like, no, we understand that people have had to use Windows. Maybe they didn't mind it. Maybe they even loved it. But we want everybody to love using Windows. It took Microsoft nearly 10 years to arrive at that conclusion. Not joking, pretty much they have lost the whole mobile market because of that. Windows 11 is a response to Chrome. That's what it's a response to. It took them so long to figure this out that they really have lost that market. And now, when you really think of the world today in computing, the PC is a shrinking dynamic where your mobile operating systems are expanding, right? More and more people using Android, more and more people using iOS. What OS are they not using? Windows. They're not using Windows. More and more people using Chrome, more and more people using iPad OS. What are they not using? Windows, right? If they had caught this vision much sooner and said, whoa, wait a minute, everything's shifting. How can we fill this need and make ourselves better? It wouldn't happen, honestly. It really wouldn't. And there's bullet points. I'll let you read those because I've talked about it multiple times. So here we go. This is some of the operating systems I just wanted to show you. OS2 Warp. This is Windows NT. This is Amiga DOS. This is BOS. And those were operating systems that for the most part, you never saw because of the dominance that Microsoft showed at the time. And a lot of that dominance coming from, you will sell this or you'll be in trouble, right? So the PC has become a platform for everyone uses, and its uses are to work and play. It's used in nearly every aspect of our lives. The computer is many things. It's a medium. It provides art, culture, and information. It's a way to connect to the rest of the world and communicate in ways that were not possible 30 years ago. Here's the question: will computers continue to provide for these things for us, or will they be replaced by similar but more advanced technologies? this course will give you the tools that you need to help understand those factors. And hopefully by this point in this course, you realize that that is true. And I've been teaching you about the social theories, that I'm showing you examples of how this has happened, with the whole goal of being able for you to be ready for these kinds of switches, for these kinds of things to happen, so that you're successful in your own personal life as you grow into your career. If you have questions or comments, let me know. I will be covering some of these factors a little bit to tie into the stories that are behind this. But that's it for today, and thanks for watching.